Hi, and welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me today. The topic today is the hidden aspects of the mitzvah of the Shalosh Seudot, or the 3 meals on Shabbat, and in particular, how they relate to redemption, how they bring on redemption. Now, some rabbis really emphasize the mitzvah of the Shalosh Seudot, and they say we absolutely must fulfill this mitzvah in order to bring Mashiach. And by fulfilling the mitzvah, they mean that we have to wash for bread 3 times and we have to bench 3 times. And as we will explore, not only do we eat for Onek Shabbat, for the delight or pleasure of Shabbat, but actually these 3 mandated meals are strongly connected to the Geula, to the redemption as well. And I would like to bring the Maharal again, my favorite sage, of course, who shines a light on this mystical meaning, the deeper aspect of it, and the redemptive nature of this particular mitzvah. Now, in the Gemara, in Shabbat 118a, it says that anyone who fulfills the obligation to eat 3 meals on Shabbat is rescued from 3 punishments. From Havlei Mashiach, or the birth pains of Mashiach. Of course, this is the suffering that precedes the advent of Mashiach. From the din of Gehenna, from the judgment of Gehenna, and from Milchemet Gog uMagog, the war of Gog and Magog. Now, of course, the first question that comes to one's mind is, why are these 3 particular things mentioned? Why are we saved from these 3 things? And the Maharal points out that these specific 3 calamities are mentioned here in the Gemara because they are not the consequences of the failings of man, but rather they were written into the script of creation from the beginning. So let's examine each one of them. If we go to Nedarim 39b in the Gemara, it enlists the 7 phenomena that were actually created before the creation of this world. So these 7 things are the Torah, Teshuvah, Gan Eden, Gehenna, Kisei HaKavod, the throne of glory, the Beit HaMikdash, and Shem Shel Mashiach, the name of Messiah. Now, Gehenna, Gehinnom, we can use the plural, is actually linked to the Friday night meal. Why? Because this is the darkest period during our Shabbat, the night time, and of course Gehinnom is the darkest place in creation. Now, Gehinnom only exists because of Bechira, the free will of man, of course, but the Maharal says that it's an antidote to the perfect world that Hashem created. And the Maharal calls it the destiny of the imperfect. And in earlier writings, he actually emphasizes that despite popular belief that we celebrate basically the creation of the world on Shabbat, that's what we commemorate, we actually commemorate or celebrate the perfection of creation. So he calls creation perfect. Of course, we know that many things in creation are not perfect. The world we live in right now is not perfect, mostly because of the fall of man. However, from the ultimate purpose of the world, which is the Messianic era, from that perspective and from the benefit of man perspective, this world is perfect. So by eating the Friday night meal, we attach ourselves to the perfection of creation, and so we can rise above this imperfection that is represented by Gehinnom. Now, in the Kabbalistic reading, of course, the night is ruled by the Sephira of Malchut. So Malchut is the lowest Sephira. And so the evening meal is connected to the Sephira of Malchut. Of course, after we light the candles, we welcome the Shabbat Queen, and we say Lecha Dodi. And the Shabbat Queen, of course, represents the Shekhinah, the presence of Hashem. And obviously, during the darkest time of the Shabbat, we prevail over Gehinnom, which is the darkest place in creation, with a meal that celebrates the Shekhinah, and the Shekhinah, of course, is light itself. Now, let's move on to the 2 meals during the day. So there's a prophecy in Zechariah which describes the day of redemption. And it says that it will be neither day nor night as far as lightning is concerned. It will happen towards evening time that there will be light. So what we are actually reading here, according to the Maharal, he says that the sun is setting on the old world order. And because of that, we're getting close to the redemption, so tumultuous events will take place. In other words, today, all this chaos, destruction, shake-up, economic and social upheaval that we see at the moment, we are witnessing these things, and this is nothing but a transition from the old world order to the new world order of the Messianic times. And you can see when you look around yourself, I'm sure we can all see how everything is basically falling apart. The entire society is falling apart. And of course, we grieve it because we were raised in a Western culture, in a Western society. And to a certain extent, it's a sad phenomenon. However, this is supposed to be this way. Everything needs to fall apart in order to make way for Mashiach. So this era, which I believe we are already in, Chevlei Mashiach, the birth pains of Mashiach, is also a dawning of a new day in Jewish history. So this is ultimately a positive thing. So when we rise up in the morning, Shabbat morning, we rise up to a whole new reality. And so we celebrate that with the morning meal, which is the first meal of the Shabbat day. And we testify actually that in the midst of this difficult time, we stand strong and we continue to bear witness to the perfection of the creation. And this creation is taking its last steps towards redemption, the ultimate goal, which is the Messianic age. Before, however, we get to the finish line, there is a fierce resistance that meets the arrival of Mashiach and this new world order. The world itself, the secular world and other religions and the Rashaim, they feel threatened because obviously at this time, their institutions, their way of life, and their whole ideology will end up in the dustbin of history. So what they do, how they react, is basically they double down. They make a last, desperate, and oftentimes violent stand against the coming of Mashiach. So these may be, again, the days we are living in. Now, in other places, the Maharal explains that the goal of our enemies is to prevent Mashiach from coming. Now, obviously, you just have to see it as a counterforce. So you have to imagine that we're working very, very hard with all of our mitzvot to bring Mashiach. And basically, the same effort and enthusiasm that we're trying to bring Mashiach with is used by the opposite force to push back, to avert the coming of Mashiach. For us on this level, in this world, is very difficult to see the big picture because we see that Israel, Am Israel and Eretz Israel take center stage in world history right now. However, there is a higher level, there is a spiritual element in this, and in the spiritual realm, the ultimate objective of the enemy is to keep the old world order, to keep it intact, to keep it going, and to avert the redemption. We always have to remember, even in the midst of suffering, that what the enemy is trying to do is to prevent Mashiach from coming. So ultimately, the end receiver of the hatred is God. And so we know that those who hate the Jewish people hate God himself. So these are the enemies of God who are trying to basically avert the redemption. They are a counterforce. And I believe that's because obviously when Mashiach comes, there will be a Yom Hadin, there will be a day of judgment, and it's going to be very, very bad for us. Now, as we move towards the afternoon time, we have our last meal, which is the Seuda Shlishit, and we eat this meal in order to fend off Milchamet Gog Umagog. That is what the Maharal says. So these are like the last moments before the redemption, the most difficult moments in Chavlei Mashiach, when we just have to push through and attest to our faith that again, in the midst of the tragedy, there is a happy ending waiting for us, the redemption for us, for Am Yisrael, and for the world as well. The divine plan is redemption for the entire world. So the Maharal says that towards the late afternoon of Shabbat, the sun sets, and the sun sets on world history. So basically what just happened is with these 3 Shabbat meals, we have completed taking a full tour of all the epochs of human existence, human history. We started off with the things that existed before the creation of this world. Then we continued with the creation of the world. And obviously we are moving towards the eternal phase of our destiny, which is the Olam Haba. Now, we know that when Shabbat is over, it doesn't end, because the first meal that we take part in after Shabbat is a Melaveh Malka. And of course, we know that this Melaveh Malka is linked to David HaMelech, because he was told by God that he would die on Shabbat. He didn't. So each Shabbat he didn't die. He celebrated it with a festive meal, and that is our Melaveh Malka. Now, it's unnecessary to explain how David HaMelech is linked to redemption, because of course, Tzemach David, the seed of David, the sprout of David rather, will be Mashiach. And so there will be a spiritual Melaveh Malka in the Olam Haba, in Shemaim, and that is called the banquet of the righteous. And this takes place after the Tehilat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead. So the Maharal says that this banquet of the righteous that the Gemara refers to is actually a compensation that Israel will receive for all the suffering it endured during its exile. And he points out that the word Seuda, or festive meal as we call it in English, comes from the word Sa'ad or Sia, which means aid or assistance. So it's such a wonderful concept because it's a metaphysical concept we don't really understand. So each time you eat something kosher, for example, we're told that we are nourishing our neshama. We don't actually see the metaphysical process that is going on and how that food would even impact our neshama. We don't understand these things. But each time we eat a Shabbat Seuda, we're receiving this assistance from Hashem. And this is the power that Hashem gives to the believers. And the perfection that is destined for the righteous is in this Seuda. Now, there is a beautiful story in the Gemara, which the Maharal quotes in a whole different book. It is Pesachim 119b, and it talks about this banquet of the righteous. And it says that after the banquet, what we would normally do after a Seuda is, of course, somebody says Zimun and we bench. So the cup of blessing is going to be presented to all of our forefathers, and each one of them is going to refuse to say the blessing on different grounds. So the cup will be presented to Avraham Avinu, and he will say, I'm really sorry, I can't take it. I didn't merit this because I begot Yishmael. The cup will be presented to Yitzhak. Yitzhak will say, how could I possibly say Zimun? The wicked Esav came from me. Then the cup will be passed on to Yaakov, and Yaakov will say, sorry, I married 2 sisters, and that's forbidden by the Torah. Moshe will say, well, I didn't even merit to enter Eretz Yisrael. Yehoshua will say, I did not merit to have a son. And so finally, the cup will be in front of David HaMelech. He will lift up the cup, he will accept it, he will say Zimun, and he will quote from one of the Tehillim that says, I will lift up the cup of salvation. Now, the Maharal himself says that it's a very difficult pasuk to understand. So imagine if it's difficult for him, how much more difficult it is for us. Now, the first question that comes to our mind, of course, is why would David HaMelech be worthier than all of our forefathers? This is a crazy concept. And of course, if we dig a little bit deeper into each one of these stories, we know that there's more to it. Did Moses really not deserve to enter into the Holy Land. Yaakov married two sisters, but the Torah hadn't been given, so he really didn't sin. So when we start digging a little bit deeper, these stories don't actually hold up. And of course, the answer of the Maharal is that David HaMelech made teshuvah. And teshuvah is a concept that just sort of hits us in the face all the time because it's always bigger than everything else, whichever context we look at it from. So the Mara points out that even though obviously all of our forefathers were on a higher spiritual madrega than David HaMelech, there was something missing. There was a lack in each and every one of them. Something didn't add up. There was something missing. He calls it a lack. But David, because of his teshuvah, is a complete man. He's somebody who's integral, wholesome, without any lack or any blemish because of the teshuvah. So he merits to recite the Zimun. Now, this banquet of the righteous is what's waiting for Am Yisrael, what's waiting for the righteous. That this is the destiny of the righteous. And it begs the question, what is the destiny of our enemies? What's their fate? What's the fate of the Rashaim? So in Brachot 10a in the Gemara, it quotes Tehillim, and the sages have asked this question. Of course, they ask that the story of David escaping from his rebellious son Absalom is juxtaposed against the mentioning of Milchemet Gog uMagog. So the sages ask, why in Tehillim these two stories are combined? Like they have nothing to do with each other. Why is one mentioned after the other? And so the Chachamim say, why was the chapter of Absalom juxtaposed with the chapter of Milchemet Gog uMagog? And Chazal answers, they're just juxtaposed so that if a person should say to you, expressing doubt with regard to the prophecy of Milchemet Gog uMagog against the Lord and against his anointed, that is Am Yisrael, and they ask the question, is there a slave who rebels against his master? AKA, obviously, how could possibly creation rebel against the Creator? Is someone capable of rebelling against God? And you too should say to him, is there a son who rebels against his father and severs the relationship with the one who brought him into the world and raised him? Yet, nevertheless, there was such a son, Absalom, and so too there can be a situation where people will seek to rebel against God. Fascinating story. And in 2 Shmuel chapter 8, the storyline recounts how David HaMelech placed governors throughout all the territories of Edom, and it says that all of Edom became servants of David. Now, this is in the past, but I believe that this speaks to us about the future as well. And I hope this will be a reality. In fact, it's prophesied that this will be a reality because the whole world will bow to Melech Mashiach. So I pray that we may merit to participate in this Seudah of the righteous. May we see all of our enemies crushed and the whole world eventually subjugated to Melech Mashiach. Thank you and see you next time.